Do I see you laughing, John?
Yeah, I'm laughing.
Oh man. We'll save the rest of that till the end. Keep give give someone a reason to stick around.
Yeah, absolutely.
How you
What
doing, John?
episode is this?
I don't like to count normal. I figured it'd be a scholarly thing to break it up into different volumes, different chapters. So officially we're in
Yeah.
volume 2, chapter 3. I don't know if this is going to be a 3A, 3B, because reading the outline, we have a lot to cover today.
Yeah, we do. I think this particular subject may um, go over several episodes, which is
Okay,
exciting, I think.
that's good. Yeah, just for people who are new listening, I've kind of cut us off at an hour, um, just for my own sanity reasons. But that doesn't mean that we're going to stop the content an hour. We can just carry over to the next step next week and just keep on going, because I think there's a lot of great important information. I don't want to rush through it. I don't want to skip over it. This is exciting. Magic and treasure digging is the title. I don't know how much treasure digging we'll get into today, but having briefly gone over the outline, I'm excited.
Good. Yeah, I think it'll be fun. Just got to keep this party going.
Yeah. Before we jump into it, I first off wanted to thank the people who did take the time to fill out the survey. The
Oh,
big the
how,
best,
how many survey responses did we get?
not as many as I had hoped for, to be honest with you, but there's still good news even in that. My goal all along has been to make this a safe place where everyone can come and listen and find valuable information. And so in the few responses we did get, we crossed the spectrum of people who know the church is true, people who believe, and people who know the church's faults. And all of
Hmm.
them enjoy the content, enjoy the objective material presented, and have great confidence in John as our fearless leader.
Aw,
So with that, it's a win. And
yeah.
for those of you who didn't take the time, um, our inbox is always open. Feel free to provide positive, negative, whatever you want. We're always here to listen, right?
Yeah, I like that we didn't get quite as many as we wanted. That's sort of the motto, I think, of this podcast. Not quite what we wanted.
Not quite there. You know, when your goals are so lofty as 7 listeners, sometimes you gotta just settle with 6.
Yeah. Have you checked our rankings lately? Where we're at in terms of international podcast rankings?
The last time I looked at it, so we haven't done anything in a couple weeks, which
Right.
hurt us a bit. Dr. Dupay was able to kind of boost us up, and then the week after that, we kind of dipped a little bit. So I think I want to say it was 18, 19,000 when we peaked closer to 14,000. So we're ready to go back at it and climb the charts up to the top 14,000 podcasts in the world.
Heck yeah. Yeah, we'll take top 20,000 for now, but we certainly have some lofty goals.
There we
Top
go.
14,000, yeah.
Well, At, at the risk of losing anybody here, we better jump into this.
Yeah, let's do it. So, I did write, usually we just jump in without much of an introduction, but I did kind of put together a little bit of an intro to kind of uh, ease our way into this. This has been sort of a controversial topic in church history since the beginning of the church. It's one thing that, for lack of a better term, sort of plagued Joseph Smith's reputation throughout his life and even after his life. And then it transferred from plaguing him to plaguing the reputation of the church. And now I think more people are starting to reconsider the meaning of all this and have different points of view on it, and that ranges from just complete antipathy towards it, all the way to just antagonistic, and all the way on the other side of the spectrum to where just further proof reinforcing what they already knew. So I think this is a very interesting topic. I didn't hear a lot about it growing up as a member of the church. I'm not sure if you did, Tyler, but it would pop up every once in a while, and
yeah, everything I remember. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, nobody really talked. That's all right. I was just gonna say nobody really talked about it that much. Yeah, did you ever hear about this kind of stuff?
We didn't learn it in any curriculum, that's for sure. I think every time I heard it come up, it was more along the lines of, this might have happened, but we're not so sure, and we don't have trusted sources to know how much of it's true or not true. Is kind of how it came across in my world.
Right. So the topic, of course, is magic and treasure seeking, divination, that sort of thing. And I think I had heard little bits and pieces growing up, but the first time I think I was really confronted with it was, just like a lot of things, was on my mission from one of my companions who said something like, "Church history is so cool. Did you know that Joseph Smith was a treasure seeker? I think that's so cool." Which is not really the typical response to that. So anyway, this is a fascinating topic. It's one of the more, I think, exciting topics in early church history. So we'll jump in. So some of the earliest sources that we have on Joseph Smith are court cases. The earliest court case was when he was 13 years old. His father and his older brother were suing a local farmer for renting them sort of dysfunctional horses.
Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Sr.'s brother, or?
No, sorry, Joseph Smith Sr. and Alvin, Joseph's
okay,
brother, yeah.
We're suing a neighbor?
Right, or yeah, another farmer from the Palmyra area. They had just relocated. They were doing really well. They had bought their first farm. I think their first piece of land that they had actually owned in a long time. Things were looking good for them. They rented out these horses from, or maybe I think they actually bought the horses. Anyway, I'm getting caught in the weeds, but they bought these horses and they were dysfunctional, and so Joseph Smith Sr. and Alvin both took this guy to court and said the horses are dysfunctional, and they called Joseph Smith Jr., a young 13-year-old, as one of the key witnesses. So that's, with the exception of maybe census data, that's the first historical evidence that we have of Joseph Smith Jr.'s existence.
Sorry, I'm holding back a few jokes here, but let's keep it objective on this horse case.
Yeah, we do want to keep it a safe place.
I will not offend any horse lovers, so I'll keep my mouth shut.
So that was the first court case. Years later, 1826, Joseph is brought to court, this time as an accused, right, the defendant, and he's accused of being a disorderly person. And typically when we think of disorderly person, we think of somebody who's just causing trouble downtown somewhere, maybe like breaking glasses, breaking windows or something like that. Just lost my vanity light.
For us all.
So side-splittingly hilarious.
I'm sorry. Anyway. It's going to be a long hour.
But in this case, disorderly person had a much wider connotation. And in this case, in Joseph Smith's case, he was charged for being a disorderly person because he was using what he called a seer stone. And he was using it to look for treasure. And so today we're going to, or in this chapter of this podcast, we're going to dive into that world, see how exactly Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging and to what extent, what role did the idea of magic play into all of this. We're going to talk about whether he was unique in this or if this was pretty common, and what role, if any, does this play in the history of the church. That's what's happening this week on With a Stone Rolling. Okay, any questions, Tyler? Anything, any jokes you want to throw at us?
No jokes, no questions. I'm actually extremely excited about this because, as you started us off with, this is not something that the church talks about much, if at all. And so I know that it vaguely talks, not vague, it briefly talks about a court case, maybe in the Saints book or something. But I'm really excited. I'm really excited to kind of learn what you have to say here.
Awesome. So Joseph Smith is arrested. He's brought before a court in 1826. There's a judge named Albert Neely in Bainbridge, New York. And he's brought on charges of being a disorderly person. And he was likely arrested for using his seer stone to look for treasure. And sort of the context around this is that he was hired out by a man named Josiah Stoll, I believe is how you pronounce it, to look for treasure. And the interesting thing about these court cases is that there was sort of a defined process as to how to, how to charge someone with this that's been designated a disorderly person. There's three ways. First of all, there's three ways that they could have been found guilty. The first is the judge just decides, right? He goes with the evidence and decides, okay, yeah, this person's disorderly. The second is that the defendant could just confess. And then the third is that we have one or more credible witnesses testify against him. So in this case, Stoll's nephew, or Stowell, we'll just go with Stoll, his name was Peter Bridgman, had complained that Joseph had duped his uncle into thinking that he could find treasure.
Can I just point out again? I know you said this. This is 1826.
This is when the charges were brought, yeah.
The charges were brought in 1826. So he would be, I'm just kind of doing the math, 20 years old at this point.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So he's not a teenager. He's not a established, I mean, by this age, maybe you could consider that full-on adult. But 20 years old, 1826. All right.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And there's context around that too, which is at age 20, Joseph would have been sort of setting out on his own, not too different from today, but he would have been looking to set out on his own. Marriage is definitely in the picture. He would have been shopping around. That's a terrible way to say that. He would have been, looking to find a wife. He would have been looking to make a living and to buy some property, probably start his life as a farmer. So he's just trying to make ends meet, trying to get out on his own. And so
in the context of church history, this is 6 years after the 1820 vision. And when did he get the vision from Angel Moroni? When did that begin?
So that would have been 1823.
1823. So 3 years after that. I'm sure you'll get more into, I don't know, these dates are interesting to me. I'm sure you'll get more into dates of this is when the court case happened. Maybe the actual events occurred some years prior. I'm not sure, but we'll get there. All right. I'm just trying to put these dates together in my head. So thank you for humoring me.
Yeah, that's a great point. So chronologically, Joseph Smith is born in 1805. I want to say 1815, his family comes to Palmyra. 1820 is when he claims to receive his first vision. 1823 is when the angel Moroni appears. In 1825 is when he is hired out by Josiah Stowell to go look for buried treasure, essentially. So we know Joseph at this point, he'd had the vision from Moroni. He had reportedly seen the place. People around Palmyra had heard the story. And so he was starting to develop this reputation as someone who had special abilities to find things of value in supernatural ways. And so Stoll had heard about this guy, and what he does is he comes about 150 miles to Palmyra. He loads up his cart, his wagon, drives to Palmyra, just on basically a gossip of this young kid's abilities to find treasure. So he goes there, and he goes to Palmyra. He finds the Smiths. He goes in. He does this sort of brief interview to kind of get to know them. And in this court case, it comes out that Stoll had actually sort of quizzed Joseph to try to figure out what kind of abilities he had. And according to Stoll, Joseph was able to look into his seer stone and describe Stoll's farm and his property with pretty specific details. And that was enough to convince Stoll that Joseph had some abilities that could be used for, finding money, essentially. But I want to go back to this court case because apparently the records weren't too good. There's lots of sources around the court case. There's some overlap among the sources, but there's also some contradictions. For example, it's not very clear as to whether Joseph was convicted or not. One source says that he was. Another source says that he wasn't. Oliver Cowdery, for example, in 1835 said that Joseph was acquitted honorably. But then there's other records of people who claim to have been there who heard, who were not there, but who claimed that Joseph was convicted. So we're not really sure how it turned out. We do know that there's no record of him being incarcerated after the trial. So it's kind of hazy as to what happened. But the significance of this court trial is that it shows that Joseph did believe that he had some kind of power to find things of value, and that he was not afraid to use it in some capacity. And it also shows that this was a common occurrence, that people did this sort of thing around the New England, Palmyra, upstate New York area.
So do we have reason to believe that Joseph did this regularly as a job, or do we think that this is a one-off case where he might have just, if Mr. Stoll reached out to him and he said, "Sure, I think I can do it." Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. So we do have reason to believe that it was not a one-time occurrence, and that Joseph had done this sort of thing, and even Joseph Sr. had done this sort of thing before. And I suppose we could talk about that now. I had it later on, but the Smiths actually had a long history of believing in magic. One of Joseph's great-great-grandfathers was actually involved in the Salem witch trials and accused a woman of being a witch. And she didn't make it. The trial didn't go well for her.
I think I saw that one. She turned me into a newt.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah, it's a fair court. So yeah, he had a great grandfather who was involved in that. And then more contemporary, they had a neighbor whose name was Orlando Saunders, who reported that Joseph's family actually believed in witchcraft. And there was lots of stories about that, not just stories, but reputable interactions in which the Smiths sort of came out as saying, yeah, we believe in magic, we believe in witchcraft, that sort of thing. For example, one story tells of Joseph Sr. enchanting guns at a turkey shoot so that they couldn't kill turkeys. I don't know the context of that story, but it's used as an example to show that they did believe in this sort of thing. There's
Hey,
also
John.
evidence. Yeah.
Oh, well, give us a little bit of insight then, because obviously this we started off. This isn't something that we read through our typical textbooks or anything like that. How would a historian decide? First off, maybe find these sources and decide, oh yeah, this is something that we can rely on, or not. In a case like this, where I mean, neighbors talk, who knows how if we can believe them or not. How would one go about determining if these accusations, or not even accusations, but um, opinions of the family are accurate?
Yeah, that's a good question. You have to be very careful with all historical sources of this type because, as we've talked about before in this podcast, everybody has an objective. Everybody uh, comes into it with different what's the word um, ways of looking at things. They have their own perspectives.
Bias?
Yeah, biases, prejudices, all that sort of thing. So yeah, you do have to be very careful. In this case, a lot of the sources, the neighbors in this case, or people who knew the Smiths, um, you have to look at the context in which they are relating these stories. Was this part of a puff piece that someone was writing about Joseph? What was the agenda of the source? What was the agenda of bringing the source out? So in this case, Orlando Saunders was a friend of the Smiths who actually held them in high esteem. He considered Joseph to be a very hard worker and thought the Smiths were a pretty respectable family. So he wouldn't have much of a reason to lie or to harm their character in any way. And besides, to him, to someone in this time period in this area, and we'll get into this, sort of believing in these kinds of things, in enchantments and divination, would not have been a big deal. And so for someone like Saunders who says, oh yeah, they believed in that sort of stuff, it would have maybe seemed a little bit unorthodox, but not all that unusual. So that's something that we can rely on. Other cases, if you look at newspaper articles, like in the court case, for example, if we're looking at a source from Stoll's family, then we could probably say, okay, so their agenda is to bring down the character of Joseph because they believe he's a charlatan. So we have to take what they say with a grain of salt. And then you even have to dissect what they're saying. Like some things might have less of an agenda than other things, right? Like a timeline, for example. We can probably rely on a timeline that they give us, some more objective fact. But if it comes down to Joseph's character or what his motivations were, then in that case, we have to step back a little bit and re-examine it. Another thing that you look for is overlap. Are people saying the same things? And it's just like in a court case, right? If you have two or more witnesses come in and say the same thing, then you can be pretty sure that that's actually what happened. So those are the big things. You look for agendas, you look for prejudices, you look for overlap, you look for reliability, and that reliability is based on when they said it, who they were, all that kind of stuff. And for example, in this court case, the 1826 court case, one of the big sources that comes out of it is someone who claimed to have been there, but wrote about it, I think, 50 years after. And they're telling us about it from memory. So in that case, you can get general facts from it, maybe, but it's not the most reliable Does that answer your question? Clarify some things?
Yes, yes, that does. Thank you. I might have. Um, so you wouldn't count on the guy's shirt color if he's saying it 50 years later. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a source, and you'd want to look at it, but
all right.
it's
No, that
questionable
does
how much
help.
weight you give
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Sorry to get you off
So
track.
no, you're good. So there's ample evidence that the Smiths believed in this sort of thing. In fact, another friend who was a friend of Joseph's sister, who claimed to have visited the Smiths frequently, was in their home a lot, had meals with them, said that Joseph Jr. actually had a divining rod. And a divining rod is just a stick that maybe has some unique characteristic to it that you can use to find water or buried treasure, things like that. And a lot of people have experience with that. And Joseph Smith Sr. Also had a divining rod that he would use. There's pretty good evidence of that. And again, this wasn't unique. There's articles from newspapers that were written and published around the Palmyra area that talked about people actually having success using divining rods. For example, one Palmyra newspaper reported that a man in Vermont was able to find enough treasure to build himself a house and buy some really nice things and use this house as kind of a hotel, a place where travelers could come and visit. There's also an
They found
article.
like buried gold treasure,
Yeah,
like from. I mean, the stories back then were what, pirates and I don't know who else would have buried treasure.
yeah,
That's what the article says he found. That's what the article says he found.
yeah, buried treasure. And you have to remember, this is the early 19th century, right? So America had won its independence maybe 40, 50 years before this. Before that, there's the colonial times, which lasted, I don't know, 150 years or so. And so it's really not that far removed from explorers coming in. And Tyler, I mean, you remember basic American history, right? Where people came to the colonies in the New World to find treasure, to find mines, to find gold, dig it up, store it, that sort of thing. And the world of Joseph Smith is not that far removed from it. So finding treasure or jewels or gold or whatever that had been left behind just a few hundred or so years before wasn't that unusual. Like it feasibly existed to them, whether it did or
So
not. It was easy for them to comprehend.
okay. So are you putting an opinion out there as to whether or not there was buried treasure, or are you just saying it's not too far fetched for them to believe such?
I'm saying it's not too far fetched for them to believe it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm,
So
I, I'm
remember. Oh, go ahead.
yeah. Oh no, I was about to say my opinion, but then I remember my opinion doesn't matter. So continue. You can go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, we've talked about this before, right? In previous episodes. It's not really. Yeah, it's interesting as to whether that kind of thing existed, whether there was treasure hidden around the hills of upstate New York. But what's more interesting and more valuable is to consider how people at that time viewed it, like how Smith and his contemporaries would have regarded these stories of treasure, buried treasure around the area. It's just like when we talked about, life of Jesus, whether it doesn't really matter if the miracles happened or not. What matters from a historical perspective is how people regarded the life of Jesus. So
Right.
anyway, so there's that. And another example of how people felt about this was there was the American Journal of Science and Arts, a pretty reputable publisher, wrote in 1826, the same year as Joseph Smith's trial. They said, these irrational and preposterous opinions, they're talking about divination and magic, are still found to predominate over the minds of a numerous class of honest but credulous and unlettered citizens, Indeed, they are sometimes cherished by those who have just pretensions to information above mediocrity. So the value of that sentence is that it shows that this was a widespread belief. People all across the United States believed, and in Europe, as a matter of fact, believed in divination, believed in the supernatural, believed in magical arts. So the fact that the Smiths believed this sort of thing really was not that unusual. Yeah, maybe some people who considered themselves more intellectual would have looked down upon them for that sort of belief, but really it wasn't that unusual.
Do you remember when Mark Twain was alive? But that was after this a little bit. I just think of I don't know if it's Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. They find all that buried treasure.
Yeah, Mark Twain
I know it was after
was,
this, but I don't know how much.
yeah,
Anyway,
he was
doesn't matter.
more famous, I think, like right after the Civil War is when he started writing stuff, like around the Civil War times. So like 40 years after this.
Okay, but still, there's that culture of treasure under the ground.
Yeah,
Whether or not he believed it was true or not, he definitely included it in his novels.
exactly. Yep. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good point. I think that it probably would have persisted somewhat into the post Civil War period.
I feel like I would be remiss if I did not bring up the buried treasures in Utah nowadays. Isn't there a individual or somebody who goes and buries money and gives clues to go find it every single year? Or is that just what the news? I don't know. I'm a little far removed from my Utah days, but I I
that's a
think that's going on in Utah right now.
that's a whole nother podcast that we should do, finding this guy's alleged buried treasure. But yeah, I don't know anything about that.
No more tangents.
Okay, so I do want to talk about Josiah Stoll and why he would have hired Joseph. Again, we've already kind of talked about it, but Stoll was this guy who was very, from all accounts, a very determined individual, very brash and proud. Didn't like to be told no, and once he got an idea in his head, he was very determined to carry it out. And he had bought a large tract of land not too long, around the same time that the Smiths moved to Palmyra, I believe. And he was convinced that there was a Spanish mine on his property that had buried coins. And so he went to Joseph, contacted Joseph. They put together some kind of agreement with Joseph and Joseph Sr. that promised the Smiths 2/11 of whatever they found. I mean, I don't know why 2/11. It seems pretty random and arbitrary, but that was the agreement. And again, he hired Joseph because he had heard of Joseph's reputation as a treasure seeker, as having someone who had these qualities. And to go back a little bit, when Joseph was young, he had friends come over, and he would tell these friends that he could find water and treasure with the stick or with the stone that he had. And so this reputation, it travels around and got Stoll excited. And again, Smith
would this be the same? Would this be the same seer stone that we can find pictures of on the church website now, or would this be a different stone at this time frame?
Yeah, good question. There is some ambiguity about that. So here's the things that we know about the seer stones. Joseph had at least two, and we think he found the first one, we think, in 1819, 1822, when he was digging a well with a guy named Willard Chase. And they're digging this well, they're down deep in the ground, and Chase finds this stone, this very unique stone, and it's brown with sort of a swirling pattern on it. And Joseph asks if he can have it, and Chase I imagine, says, sure, why not? It's just this worthless stone. But then later on, when Chase finds out that that Joseph considers this to be a seer stone and that he's using it for divination purposes, he actually asks for the stone back. So there you have even more evidence that this was a pretty prevalent belief. So much so that Chase didn't just dismiss Joseph as being this kook. Like, I found the rock. I know it does nothing. Let him, mess around with it as much as he wants. Instead, Chase is like, whoa, that stone has magical properties. I want it back. And he was trying to get it back as late as 1830. So Joseph has the stone, and we think that that's the one he used. That's the one that the church has pictures of. It's the one that he used in translating the Book of Mormon. It's sort of the more famous one. There's also stories of a second stone that was more whitish in color. This stone he held on to for longer. He showed it to the Quorum of the 12 later on in his life. Some people argue that stone was actually more important than the brown one, and that he used that one to translate the Book of Mormon and the Egyptian papyri, all that sort of thing. Then, of course, Brigham Young later on said that Joseph Smith had as many as 5 stones. So there's some ambiguity there, but I think the general belief among historians is that this brown one, the one that the church has in its possession, that they've shown pictures of, that was Joseph's primary stone. And he used that for divination purposes and for translating the Book of Mormon, at least partially.
Okay. So do we think that that's the first seer stone? Is that the right term? Just for our discussion.
The first one that he had?
The 1822 one that he found, is that the first one that we know that he had?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. He may have had some before that.
That we just don't have record of.
Yeah, it's probably pretty likely that he did, or that he had one that he considered to be a seer stone. I think I read that the whitish one that he had, he dug up before, or he found before he found the brown one. But yeah, it's tough to say. There's not a ton of reliable information on it.
Understand.
Yeah. So kind of what we talked about, this sort of thing wasn't that unusual. So I'd like to dive into sort of the context around this magical belief. There was some overall acceptance that magic was real. Again, we talk about the New York Medical Journal, what they said about it, and a lot of it just comes from biblical tradition, right? If you go back 200 years to the time of Joseph Smith, the thing that people are reading the most, overwhelmingly, is the Bible. And what's in the Bible? Well, it's stories about miracles, it's stories about the supernatural. And even as far back as Joseph, the son of Jacob, right? There's this scripture in Genesis 44, and I'm not an Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, but in Genesis 44, it's the story of when Joseph frames his little brother to test his brothers, right? He sticks a cup in his little brother's bag to frame him, and the cup that he sticks in there isn't just any cup. It's a cup that he uses for divination. So there's evidence there that Joseph, the Old Testament prophet, was into sort of magical concepts at that time. And we're going to see how that definition of magic changes over time. So we know that in Old Testament times, Hebrew Bible times, there was this sort of overall acceptance of the supernatural. And it keeps going on, right? Moses has the brass serpent. It's an object that becomes a source of healing for the Israelites. Also, the priests in Egypt are able to turn their staffs into snakes. You know that story, right? And Moses is snake staff, eats their snake staffs, that
John,
sort of thing. Yeah.
so when we discussed this before, I recall kind of distinguishing two different types of supernatural powers. There's godly miracles, and then there's magic, which we kind of said comes from the devil.
Hmm.
Is this at this time would they have seen these magic, treasure digging, and divine rods and things like that as something that was powered by satanic influence?
Yeah, there were definitely some people who regarded that, who regarded it that way, and we'll get into that. Uh,
Okay.
so so yeah, again, you have people in this uh, early America who are reading the Bible, reading about these miracles, reading about Jesus performing miracles, and there's an easy it's easy for them to accept it as fact, right? And even though we're in the midst of the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, um, you still have people who are accepting this sort of thing quite easily. And you start to see the split during the age of the Reformation. Right? Now, just a little bit of context about the age of the Reformation. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses on the door of the Catholic Church. Says this is what's wrong with the church, and out of that uh, springs a whole list of different denominations: Protestant, Lutherans, Calvinists. All these different ideologies come from this age of the Reformation. So you have lots of different types of Christianity all of a sudden, and that sort of leads into an acceptance of rationality. Anyone that performed miracles was sort of, you start to see this belief that anyone who performed miracles was not of Jesus. Uh, and so you have one theologian, for example, named William Perkins, who's a Protestant. He followed the Reformation, wrote in the early 17th century that miraculous works were the works of Satan, and that miracles had ceased even before the Catholic Church had been formed. And this Protestant belief comes out of, a lot of it comes from a derogatory view of Catholicism, because in Catholicism, there's a lot more of a willingness to accept the supernatural. And you still see that today, but back then, especially, you'd have people who would claim to have seen the Virgin Mary. You know, they're having visions of these supernatural divine beings. That was a very Catholic type of belief, and Protestantism shunned that, mostly as a way to distinguish themselves from Catholicism. But it didn't go away completely, and we'll get into that. But as the Protestant Reformation kind of evolves and the Enlightenment takes over, you have characters like Thomas Jefferson, who's probably the most famous people of the Enlightenment. He's like the perfect embodiment of what the Enlightenment was. He saw the value in religion. He saw the value of the Bible, but he didn't necessarily accept it as truth. For example, Jefferson wrote his own Bible, and I may have mentioned this before, but he writes his own Bible and he cuts all of the miracles out of it because he doesn't think they're true, and therefore they don't have very much worth to him. So, so you have these enlightened individuals, but you still have a population of Protestants, of Christians, who are trying to merge religion with rationality, and miracles just didn't quite fit. You know, they're trying to adopt these different ideologies, trying to make them work, and miracles are just too far-fetched for them to accept them completely. That's one section of the population. You see that population kind of start to grow. However, in rural communities, especially, this belief in magic persists. And again, this goes back to because they're reading the Bible, it's easy for them to accept that, right? Part of the reason to believe in Jesus is that he was able to perform miracles. He's a divine person, therefore he's a miracle worker, and vice versa, right? He's He's a miracle worker, therefore he should be divine. So the one example of this is the Puritans, who we've talked about a little bit. One guy named Lawrence Clarkson, who's a pretty well-known Puritan, becomes a treasure seeker. And even though the Puritans believed in the witch trials, right? They were the ones that pushed the witch trials that we all know about. That the witch trials kind of give the indication that they didn't approve of magic. But again, it goes back to your point. There's two different kinds of magic, right? And there's a lot of sexism involved there too, which is these women shouldn't be able to do these kinds of things.
Witchcraft.
Exactly. Yeah. And
can I ask one more question? I appreciate this explanation, and I just had the thought come across. So we talked about divining rods, I believe it's called, and
divining rods, yeah.
Divination
rods.
Is the magic we're referring to almost primarily to find hidden things under the ground, or is it? Because when I think of treasure hunting, I think of it more as a you have a map and you have to follow the map. But it sounds like it's a very different process here. When we're talking magic, is that primarily what we're talking about, or is there other magic aspects that play into this as well?
Yeah, it's definitely much more broad than that.
Okay.
I mean, treasure seeking is sort of the most attractive aspect of it, right? You think about Indiana Jones, there's a lot of supernatural stuff going on there. Even nowadays, we're still interested in that sort of thing. But it definitely goes beyond that. It involves fortune telling, astrology, healing, all that sort of stuff. Basically anything supernatural. But you bring up a good point. It's like, what is magic in the minds of someone who's living at the time of Joseph Smith? And there's different definitions, right? History is not that uniform, right? For some people, let's say someone who's healed, that's divine magic, right? It's divine. It's a miracle. And then if they were to see somebody, let's say, speak with tongues at a revival, and it freaks them out, well, that's of the devil. Then that's magic. That's not a miracle. You know what I mean? So there's different definitions of it throughout this time in this area, geographical differences, all that sort of stuff. But at the very base level, magic can be considered anything supernatural. Can we go off that definition?
Yeah, it kind of complicates things when I think too hard about it based on the context, but I'll go with it.
Okay. Yeah, so anything that can't be explained, right, very easily. And again, it goes back to this effort to sort of tie rationality with the unexplainable together in religion, and we're still doing that today.
Yeah. So in my mind, then it's and the reason I'm going down that path is it's difficult for me to see Joseph Smith interpret it as anything other than godly miracles. Is there any evidence that that's how he saw it, or that he might have seen it differently than that?
That he might have seen what?
Just
like
the magic that he's capable of performing.
Yeah,
from his
that's
perspective.
That's a great question. Actually, in going back to the 1826 trial, he definitely attributes his abilities to the divine, that God has given him a gift. Joseph Smith Sr., in this trial, he's called as a witness, and he sort of laments that people are given this gift of divination and they use it to become wealthy. And he says something like, we pray every day that Joseph will be given direction as to how to use his gift to complete God's will. So there's definitely some sense there that Joseph's gift is not to be used for wealth, right? Or that they're hesitant to use it that way. And that does represent a shift in the Smith family thinking, because Joseph Sr. definitely was into treasure seeking in the years prior to this. And, in some ways, you can't blame him. The Smiths were very, very poor. Plus, they're getting bombarded with all these stories of treasure seekers actually hitting it rich. Right. And so, go ahead.
I was going to say that to me aligns with the narrative as well of the gold plates. You talk about
Yep.
it sounds like you're talking about it from a job perspective, but it sounds like a very similar narrative of you can't get the gold plates until your intentions are to not do this for wealth, but to, I don't know the term, to do God's will.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That's the common story around the gold plates, is that Joseph Smith couldn't take them right away. And Oliver Cowdery told the story that when Joseph first found them, he goes to touch them and he can't. Either he's shocked or he's somehow restrained from taking them, because his initial response was, I can use these to get rich. And so that 4-year time period was to be used to overcome that desire, at least partially. So yeah, you're right. There is sort of you can see sort of the shift in mentality from, you can use this gift to become well off and to take care of your family, at least financially, or you could take it even further and say you could use this gift to become rich. To shift from that to, we need to use this gift to accomplish God's will.
And you mentioned that Joseph Smith Sr. said that during the 1826 trial. Is that when the shift is kind of becomes apparent?
Yeah.
Was that that court trial?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's when you can see the shift kind of happen, but definitely happen. Just again, he goes from being a treasure seeker to take care of his family to praying that Joseph finds a way to use this gift to accomplish God's will. So.
And when does he actually purportedly obtain the gold plates?
It would have been in 1827, so the year after this trial.
The year after, okay, because he was then ready.
Right, according to the story, right?
Yeah. All right. Is this a good place to put a cliffhanger, John?
Yeah, I think so. So again, just to summarize, we are leaving this world that we're talking about in sort of this tension between rationality and the supernatural. Like, how do we accommodate the two, or how do they accommodate the two, right? That's what they would have been thinking. How do we accommodate these two different ideologies? And Joseph Smith is smack dab in the middle of it. And right now, at this moment in time that we're talking about, he's definitely a believer and practicing magic, or at least he thinks he is, right? And he's gained a reputation for that. And so now the question is, how widespread was this? How unique was Joseph Smith in this? And what were people saying about it? We'll go more into what the world looked like around this question.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is some interesting things. I think the most common feedback we get in this is thanks, John. This has gotten me thinking about things I haven't considered, and I think that's a great.
Nice.
I think that's a great takeaway. Is that it helps us really put a fuller context around this history, and really help us understand in ways that we haven't thought of it before. Not that our thoughts are wrong, but I think that this just adds another layer of depth to it. So I do appreciate the context and all this that you're bringing with this podcast.
You're welcome. Yeah, it's been fun. That's definitely the goal, that we talk about it all the time, is just to broaden the world of church history, So we're not just confined to things that we've grown up with or things that we've heard. The idea is to really sort of paint a broader picture of it all.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you. If there's nothing else, I will kick us off with my coined term, if I can remember what. There we go. Well, thanks, John. Appreciate it. Life's rough and roll on.
Thanks, Tyler.